The first thing to know about Bonnie and Clyde's last day isn't the hail of bullets or the gleaming Ford 5.8 you see in so many movies. The real story starts with what happened right after, when years of tabloid myth collapsed into the messy, physical facts of two dead outlaws in a car that looked like it had been dragged through a war zone. You know how the legend goes. Depression-era lovers, wild and defiant, finally brought down by lawmen in a heroic roadside shootout. That's the Hollywood version, the clean ending. The truth? It's much uglier, much louder, and a lot more physical than any film has ever dared to show. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow's last moment happened in the sticky heat of a Louisiana morning, the 23rd of May, 1934. A six-man posse unloaded their guns into the Ford 5.8 until it sounded like thunder on a gravel road. Less than 20 seconds later, the car was silent. Bonnie and Clyde were slumped together, riddled with bullets, blood pooling into the dust, their torn clothes sticking to the sea. And yet, somehow, the legend didn't even slow down. Most people picture a respectful aftermath, a white sheet, a somber photograph, bodies wheeled quietly away, the story sealed with one mournful headline. But that's not what happened. The quiet after the shooting barely lasted a few minutes. Then word spread fast. That's when things turned into a real American spectacle, the kind that makes you question just how polite history ever was. Within a single hour, the bullet-riddled Ford and its dead passengers became the center of the strangest roadside show the country had ever seen. Locals heard the news by shouts, by car horns, or just the magnetic tug of fame, everyone from nearby farmhouses, gas stations, and stores started making their way to the scene. And as they arrived, it wasn't just to gawk. Some brought knives or scissors, some brought nothing but curiosity. All of them wanted a piece of the car, the story, or even the dead. By midday, chaos had taken over. The old dirt road was jammed with cars, wagons, and people on foot, all pushing toward the battered Ford 5.8. In a matter of hours, hundreds were fighting for position, elbowing past deputies, shouting for a better view. The closer people got, the stranger it became. Hands reached through broken windows, over doors, through bullet holes still slick with blood and glass. The car wasn't just a wreck anymore, it was a gruesome relic, and the real prize was inside. This is where those romantic myths crash into the reality of American fame. These weren't just spectators, they were souvenir hunters. They wanted proof. A lock of Bonnie's bloody hair, a button off Clyde's coat, a strip of shirt, a chunk of glass torn from the dashboard. Some reached for whatever they could grab. Others came ready with their own tools. There are plenty of period accounts written by reporters, lawmen, and bystanders of people crawling over each other to cut, tear, or scoop up a piece of infamy. And through all of this, Bonnie and Clyde's bodies stayed exposed, twisted, battered, soaking the car in blood, mouths half open. Some in the crowd just stared. Others started laughing. A few even posed for photographs, grinning at the flashbulbs like it was a carnival, not a crime scene. The air was thick with gunpowder, sweat, blood, and hot Louisiana dirt. If you want to understand what outlaw celebrity really meant in 1934, picture this: 100 hands clawing for a piece of the dead, police shouting themselves hoarse, and history being ripped apart for souvenirs. The lawmen, Frank Hamer, Ted Hinton, the whole posse tried to push the mob back. They cursed, shoved, waved rifles, and threatened to arrest anyone who crossed the line from order to chaos. But the crowd was too big, and the law was too thin. Deputies tried covering the bodies with jackets or tarps, only to have those ripped away in seconds by eager hands. Sometimes they physically pulled people off the car, only to turn and see more rushing in. It was like trying to hold back a flood with a broom. Every new arrival just made things worse. Some wanted keepsakes for themselves, others saw a chance for fast cash. And in the mess, the bodies suffered more than just indignity. Bonnie's dress was shredded, her hair yanked out in bloody clumps. Clyde's shirt was cut to ribbons, his pockets turned inside out, his face smeared with dust, sweat, and the fingerprints of strangers. There are solid reports from the time, grim but consistent, that people wanted more than just fabric or hair. The appetite for relics escalated fast. If this were a modern crime scene, you'd expect police tape, evidence bags, something to keep the bodies safe from the curious and the greedy. In 1934 Louisiana, all you got was a handful of exhausted lawmen and the distant threat of a jail cell that everyone knew was probably empty. The ground around the car became a battleground. Some people came armed with nothing but curiosity, others with knives, scissors, or straight razors, all for the purpose of cutting off a piece of history. Lawmen would drag someone away, only to turn back and find 3 more crawling through a window. At one point, a deputy was nearly dragged off his feet trying to pull a woman away from Bonnie's body. She had a fistful of hair, blood streaking her knuckles, and a wild look in her eyes. When he shouted, she just laughed, let go, and vanished into the mob. And it didn't stop at hair or scraps of clothing. Buttons were torn off Clyde's jacket, his shirt sliced away, strips of bloody cloth fluttering in strangers' hands. One man, apparently, even tried to pry out a tooth until a bystander yelled and a deputy stepped in. There were attempts at Clyde's ear and, more than once, at his trigger finger. Bonnie lost whole locks of hair, roots and all, leaving her scalp raw and bleeding in the heat. If this is starting to make you queasy, you're in good company. Even some of the lawmen were appalled. Frank Hamer, the legendary Texas Ranger, was red-faced and sweating through his shirt, swearing at the crowd, threatening to pistol whip anyone who touched the bodies again. But even he couldn't stop the mob. They just flowed around the law like water around a rock, each wave bolder than the last. There's something almost darkly comic about the situation. Imagine a squad of hardened lawmen, fresh off the most famous ambush in American history, now reduced to slapping at the hands of little old ladies and farm boys, all desperate for a bloody keepsake. At one point, a deputy actually fired a warning shot in the air, not to clear the mob, just to be heard over the noise. It worked for about half a minute. Then someone's camera flashed. Another hand reached in, and the cycle started again. The whole ordeal didn't just look bad, it felt bad. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of blood and old sweat. The ground was sticky with blood, spilled sodas, torn bits of fabric, even a half-eaten sandwich trampled underfoot. Flies started to gather, drawn by the stink and the heat. Some people in the crowd tried to justify themselves, claiming they just wanted a piece of history, a story to tell the kids. Others got right to the point. Bloody fabric, a lock of hair, or a bullet casing could fetch a week's wages in Dallas or Shreveport. That rumor spread fast, and the crowd surged again, now not just desperate, but aggressive. Lawmen called in for backup, but new uniforms didn't help much. The mob wasn't getting smaller. Officers barricaded car doors with their own bodies, arms wide, but hands still snaked in beneath them. fingernails scraping for anything loose. Some inventive souls even crawled under the car, reaching up through the floorboards for souvenirs. You've got to give them points for creativity, if not for decency. By now, Bonnie and Clyde were almost unrecognizable, swollen faces, clothing torn to rags, blood pooling in their eyes and mouths. Fresh scratches and bruises not from bullets, but from people hungry for a slice of mortality. The bodies that had filled headlines as romantic outlaws were now battered relics, marked as much by the crowd as by the lawmen's guns. For anyone watching, the reality finally starts to sink in. This wasn't a tragic last embrace or a Hollywood tableau. This was a public scrabble, a mob stripping the dead for profit, lawmen shouting into the void, and two bodies suffering a last round of indignity. Torn buttons, broken teeth, locks of hair yanked out and carried away. Here's the blunt truth. In America, outlaw fame wasn't just about wanted posters or fatal shootouts. It came with a price measured in flesh, fabric, and whatever personal space you thought you had left. If you made the front page, you could expect to be carved up for souvenirs before your body was even cold. So if you ever think today's celebrity culture has gone too far, at least you don't have to worry about losing an ear to the crowd. Not yet. By the time the authorities finally started to clear the scene, the damage was permanent. Bonnie and Clyde weren't sent home as infamous outlaws. They were battered remains, marked just as much by the crowd's greed as by the bullets. The Ford 5.8 wasn't a glamorous getaway car anymore, more like a rolling junkyard, bullet-riddled, streaked with blood and dirt, the seats shredded with scraps of clothing and hair still scattered inside. Where Hollywood would fade out to sad music, reality just limped on a logistical headache for everyone stuck with the aftermath. For the morticians back in Dallas, what arrived was worse than anything they'd prepared for. Instead of just gunshot wounds, they found torn clothing, patches of hair ripped out, and fresh scratches left by the crowd. Embalming fluid leaked out as fast as it went in, pooling on the floor and soaking what little cloth remained. They had to plug bullet holes with rags, try to rebuild faces that had been battered by both bullets and the crowd. Any hope of restoring the famous faces was gone. The best they could do was patchwork. And if you're curious about accountability, did anyone get punished for this? Not really. The best the law could do was shoo people away, maybe shake their heads. Most souvenir hunters melted back into the crowd, their blood-stained relics tucked away, sometimes shown off to friends or grandkids decades later as proof they touched a piece of legend. Some of those treasures, locks of hair, buttons, glass fragments might still be sitting in odd family collections, a grisly inheritance from America's most famous manhunt. The death car itself became an even bigger attraction. Once the authorities hauled it away, it was displayed to the public still sticky with blood, glass, and the occasional bit of scalp. People lined up just to catch a glimpse. And if you ever meet someone claiming they own a piece of the Bonnie and Clyde death car, odds are they're not exaggerating. But the harshest consequence wasn't in the bodies, or the car, or even the blood stains left behind. It was in the myth. What happened on that Louisiana road rewrote how America remembers Bonnie and Clyde. The mob scene called ghoulish, disturbing, and unprecedented in the press cemented the couple not just as outlaws, but as objects of morbid public obsession. The fantasy of doomed lovers was replaced, at least for anyone who saw the photos, with the reality of skin and clothing torn not just by bullets, but by the hands of ordinary citizens desperate for a keepsake. For the men who hunted Bonnie and Clyde, there was no Hollywood satisfaction. Even Frank Hamer, the legendary Texas Ranger, was left standing at the edge of the chaos, forced to defend dead criminals from the same public that had demanded their capture. There's a bitter symmetry here. In life, Bonnie and Clyde ran from the law, desperate for privacy, dignity, and control over their own story. In death, they lost all three. Their legend survived, but only because the mob made sure there were enough physical relics to go around. So, next time you watch the movie version, the slow-motion shootout, the tragic embrace, the lovers frozen in time, remember how it really ended. There was no final embrace, just a crowd with knives and scissors, a lawman trying to save an ear, a mortician with a mop and a handful of cotton plugs, hoping the next leak wouldn't ruin the suit. The price of outlaw immortality was taken out in flesh and fabric, not just in ink. If you want to know what happened to the infamous death car next, or how the funerals turned into their own public ordeals, subscribe for more hidden physical history behind America's outlaw legends. Sometimes the real story isn't about how legends are made, but how they're torn apart.